A quick intro for me. I'll go ahead and get started now. It's a couple minutes after, so I'm sure we'll get some more joiners as we go. So a quick intro for me. I retired from the Marine Corps in 2018. Retired a lieutenant colonel. I was an intel officer and essentially did some support to cyber, got some support from cyber, was an SSO and had to deal with the networks. And that's kind of how I started getting into the technology side of things. Is as you're signing off on networks, I had to go learn a little bit about it. And then also, if you're going to attack networks, you have to also understand it a little bit that way as well. So I am not a technician. I am not a cyber expert. I don't try to claim either of those titles. But one of the things that I'll kind of talk about as we go along is oftentimes when you work in that environment, one of the keys is to learn the language, right? You have to learn the language of where you're at. And that's one of the key sides of cyber and the support to cyber that you walk into. I titled this Resilience. It's more than security or continuity. If you're not familiar with the acronym behind my name there, CBCP, it's Certified Business Continuity Professional. I went through the Disaster Recovery Institute International's program and got certified as a business continuity professional. One of the things I think that translates well from military experience as you move along, and it works well. Most of us have a military mindset after a time in the military. It's kind of funny. I used to pride myself on not being institutionalized, but it turns out we all get institutionalized a little bit along the way. So it's one of those things that resilience is something that we kind of oftentimes build into who we are in that process, and we don't even realize it as we're going along. We don't even think about it as we go along. So when you step out of that environment into the security world or into the civilian world working in cyber or resilience or continuity, there's a lot of things that we have to go through as we learn the language of business, and we learn to adjust from what we were and what we did in the military and bring that into our environment as we step out into cyber or the security world. So that's kind of where I brought this together, was to kind of bridge some of that gap and to try to show folks what translates well and what doesn't in certain areas, so we could get to that point of understanding the differences in words. One of the things that I start with is security. When you throw the word cyber up in most businesses, cybersecurity is the first thing everybody thinks about, because everybody talks about the breaches, all these ransomware attacks, and that's all over the news. So instantly people start thinking about security when you're talking about cyber. So, I thought, let's talk about security a little bit. When you look at it, NIST is one of the big frameworks that people look at that identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. It's a similar cycle to what we looked at in the military side of things, but again, it's one of those standards. When we step out into business and we step out into the cybersecurity world, we have to make sure that we're adjusting to whatever the standard is that our business and our company operates on. NIST is one of the most common ones, so I use that to kind of baseline and start from. But we talk about security. Detect, respond, recover. That's where we tend to look at most of the time. And I love how they talk about respond and recover. A lot of places don't really spend that much time thinking about that recovery strategy. But, again, how are we going to set up cybersecurity, and how are we going to process through that in the way we look at it? Now, from a military mindset, we start out with, how do we have the right defense? For those of us that spent much time in the military, we oftentimes have, get drugged through a lot of military history. And if you look at the way that after the carnage of World War I, you look at how France looked to defend itself. They built this huge defense called the Maginot Line. It's very structured and very strong, probably one of the most impressive defenses built in the history of military warfare, right? The Maginot Line. Well, we do the same thing in industry. We have put out our antivirus process. We have attack surface management. We go through user training, just like we did in the military, right? You've got all this cyber training, and it's boring and repetitive. And really, honestly, what we're seeing in the trends as you look is the defense isn't enough. What happens is every good defense, the first thing happens is an adversary looks for a way around it. So is defense really enough to secure your network? defense is an important part. We have to set up a defense. We have to establish something. But if we stop there, if defense is where we stop, cyber defense, then we're probably going to end up short in this process. And it's one of the things that you'll see over and over again when you look through after actions, when you look through the root cause analysis of stuff, is just about every company had some sort of defense in place. But was it enough? Probably not. And oftentimes it looks at what was the attack last time, or what was the last major compromise that they saw out there, and they'll go look for products and services that defend against those things, not thinking about the fact that the adversary is going to evolve to the defenses that are put out in place. So that tends to be one of those things. It's a militarism that, we always look at fighting the last war, but businesses do it too. So we oftentimes in the veteran community look for ways around that. We try to absolve ourselves of that, but it's one of those things that it happens in the community out there regularly as you go through. The next thing that we'll look at is tools. Do you have the right tools? There's a lot of things out there. When you look at how World War II started, I've used kind of that theme through a portion of this brief because it's something that everybody can kind of relate to, right? We've all seen the movies or watched the specials in history, but a lot of times you miss out on things, right? In the beginning of World War II, they integrated armor, tanks with horseback cavalry. Doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Do they have the right tools at the time? When you look at that type of environment, if you're going up against a panzer division and you've got a combined horse cavalry with your tanks, you're probably not going to do so well. You don't have the right tools in your kit bag to be successful. What we find in the business world is there's a lot of tools out there. There's tons of services. There's tons of software. There's tons of tools that are brought into the security environment. We can talk about encryption of data at rest, encryption of data in move, encryption of how we're setting things in process. How are our third parties encrypting their data if we're using an outsource, right? If we're putting things up into the cloud, how is that operating? Do they have the right tools? Are they integrated from end to end? Are they part of our process? Intrusion detection. Are we looking for ways how people are coming into our operation? Are we dealing with that? How is that all set up and all that sort of stuff? And then authentication, are we authenticating people to make sure that, the right level of access is accessing our networks and our processes? How are we set up for that? Quite honestly, there's some great tools out there, but at the end of the day, just like our defense isn't enough, our tools are probably not going to be enough either. So as we're setting about security, we're going to look for, setting up a defense. We're going to look for the right tools, but most of the time, those things in and of themselves are not going to be enough. We got to have people. We got to have people in the system. One of the things, I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a Marine, so you're going to see a little bit of Marineisms here and there, but there's a certain type of individual that you recruit for the military. There's a certain type of mentality you look for, and cybersecurity and continuity tend to be the same way. You look for these certain types of people in that process, but they're not the only ones that are part of what's going on there. You've got your security team. You've got folks with a security mindset that are looking for ways to build out your security in that process, but you also need to make sure that the business employees are also thinking about the mindset of what's going on. They integrate well with the security team. They're not resistant all the time. Do you have the leadership and the climate within your company to be secure? Every company has to walk that line between being so secure that nobody can access them and being so open that everybody has access to them. You have to make sure that you have the right people in place that can handle the amount of open communication that you have, that can handle the restricted security that you have, but also, can walk that balance. The right people is so important. And that's a big part of how we get through that. Well, so we talk about security, continuity, and this is a term that a lot of folks on the military veteran side don't think about, because we refer to it as continuity of operations or just transitioning as we move from one command to another. But when you look at the International Standards Organization 22301, business continuity is specifically called out. It's specifically part of how contracts are written and how the business world operates. You have to be able to show that you can operate and provide your service to your customers, whether you're under challenge or not, and that you have a plan in place. But again, you're looking at the disruption. They start from when the disruption happens, how will you resume and recover your operations so you can restore your delivery of product and service. That's what continuity is. And that's a big part of, as I said, contracts and requests for proposals. So again, having the security items in place and having those things that we've talked about, the tools and the people, do you have the right mindset? Continuity oftentimes is a mindset. When you look at, again, going back to that World War II mindset of, we were looking at, the Axis powers were not necessarily looking at what they could do and what they could defend. They were kind of pressed into service, and they were pushed and they were told to fit into a certain mindset. Whereas on the Allies, we were talking about defending freedom. We were talking about how we were going to pull together as a collective to make the world safer and better. It was a mindset. It was a significant difference in the way we approached people and operations and all that sort of stuff. That is important in your continuity program. How do you build that culture of it becoming everyone's job? You want to make sure that you get buy-in. It has to be buy-in, not just from the top down, that vertical buy-in where your boss tells you to come up with a continuity program, but you have to build the buy-in laterally. You have to make sure that your peers and the people on both sides of you understand that your continuity is for them. It's not a service you're providing them. It's an integrated process that you come together on, so that way you help them through their continuity challenges. So if they end up being the victim of a cyber attack, how are you going to get things operating quickly to make sure that that process goes on forward? That's a big part of what continuity does, and that's a big part of what resiliency builds into. So again, I go back to, is it a library or a handbook? By definition, the standard requires you to have a plan that's well documented, that's built, and that's in a process. Many companies out there, I've seen this, they build these plans and they're great and they look really good on paper. And when you put that request for proposal out there, when you put that contract negotiation out there, you can show them this plan and this book, and it's great. But when it comes time to execute, it's like being in the library. It's just stuffed off on a shelf. You can pull it out and look at it whenever you want, but nobody cares about it. It's off somewhere else in the community, and it's really not all that useful. I recommend that we look at it like a handbook. It's something that you could stick in that cargo pocket that you can pull out when you need it, and you can, it should be, your continuity plan should be broken down and beaten up and have like grease stains on it and all that sort of stuff, just like that handbook you had when you were in the military that you kept in your cargo pocket or as you're walking around. You've got this thing that you can pull out and check. So it, you understand it. It's part of what you do on a day-to-day basis, and it allows you to move through that process of continuity, whether you're under challenge or whether you're just checking it out. That type of stuff is out there, and that's a mindset. But again, even that, the mindset isn't enough. You got to have a good strategy. You got to have things in place that, you've got all these tools, you've got this product, you've got this mindset, and now does it fit into the strategy? When you look at it, you can have a very successful strategy that you derail rapidly. When you looked at World War II, the Germans had a great strategy. They went around that Maginot Line. They're conquering territory. They're really knocking it out and doing great things. And then they fail against, they attack Russia in the winter. They do something that is militarily stupid. It was a flawed strategy. And in execution, you can see it. When you look back in history, you see it. But the problem is, at the day of execution, they didn't see it. Their strategy was flawed. You got to make sure that the business and the continuity and the resiliency and security has a strategy that makes sense. Do you have hot sites and cold sites that you can stand up if you need to? Do you have a mean time to recovery? Do you have backups and failovers that you can sit there? Can you pull up your backup and operate from your backup? Do you have a failover capability? Can you just isolate part of your network and fail over to another portion? That all has to be part of a strategy that you then exercise and execute. But, again, all these individual things out there, they're not enough. When you get to that, you have to make sure that you have relationships. Relationships matter. Do you have the right allies? In World War II, a dysfunctional team on that Axis side, Hitler and Mussolini didn't trust each other. Hirohito never came into the process. That alliance, even though they were allies, was dysfunctional, and that did not serve them well. When you look at the Allied side, our allies may not have been necessarily friends, but they were good allies. They supported one another. They communicated. They had like goals and common interests. They came together as allies. You need to make sure that your process does that same thing. Do you have business champions? If you're in cybersecurity or if you're in business continuity, the business needs to buy into what you're doing. You need champions in those areas to be able to help you integrate your security and continuity plans to the business plans. Executive sponsorship. Does somebody up in the C-suite see what's going on in the security and continuity worlds well enough to know that it needs to be integrated to the business? Do you have a voice in those committees and up at that budgetary level? If you don't, you're probably not going to do super well. You've got to make sure that you've got those. And then looking at your infrastructure experts. One of the things that I've come across, as I said in the beginning, I'm not a cyber expert. I'm not a technical expert or a network engineer. Looking for those people, I have never found one who is able to do everything in those particular areas. Some network engineers are really good at their infrastructure and servers and routers, and then others are much better at cloud-based items. So physical infrastructure versus the cloud-based infrastructure. How are, security architecture, how is that all laid out? You got to find those experts that are really good at what they do and bring them together. If you can't bring them together in the same room, sometimes they don't mix well. Then you need to be that go-between that brings their ideas together and their concepts together, because no one person is strong enough alone. If you dump all the security stuff on the CISO, your organization is probably going to fail, because he's going to have other issues and other problems to fight with, and that's not going to be successful. So you've got to make sure that you've got the right allies in place, as you're stepping through your process. So I've talked about security. I've talked about continuity and kind of give you the definitions there. So what does that mean in terms of resilience? Well, both of those things talk about response and recovery. They talk about an incident that happens and how you're going to go from there once something breaks. Resilience is what you're looking at if you're going to plan ahead of the problem. You're going to look before the problem is actually a problem and try to prevent the breakage. You want to absorb that stress and recover your functionality, and that's where resilience comes in. You're seeing a growth in this kind of industry right now. A lot of folks prior to the pandemic would talk about their failover plan and their recovery plan. They would let something break and then fix it as quickly as possible, as opposed to bending without breaking and then getting back to where they originally started. That's what resilience is. And that's kind of that next step in the evolution. So, we start out with a system, a process of systems. I use a little bit, as a Marine, you always got to have a little toilet humor in any brief that you give. So, does your system work? It's engineered to work a certain way, whether you're a paper rolls to the front kind of person or it rolls to the back kind of person is kind of irrelevant, but there's a system to the way it's supposed to roll off of there. Regardless of how well engineered your system is, you're going to run into people who don't understand the purpose of the system, the security system, the continuity system, the resilience factors in there. You're going to have people in your organization that don't understand how it works. So they will do things that the system wasn't designed to deal with. Is your system resilient enough to deal with that? External factors will come in. They're going to be internal and external people that come into your network and into your system that will do things and they don't necessarily understand what that does, and you weren't prepared for it. Is your system resilient enough to deal with that? And then there's the unintended effects. You will do things within your system to operate that you didn't see the second and third order effects of. That happens all the time. Whether it's an upgrade, whether it's a new option on an app or something like that that shuts down an old version, those types of things happen. Every system is going to have vulnerabilities. There are going to be flaws in the system. So the more systematic we tend to become in our security and continuity, oftentimes we do that at the expense of our resilience. As professionals, as veterans, we have to make sure that we're watchful of that and mindful of that. And oftentimes what you'll find is there are people that can do small changes really quick and they just tweak it. And that tends to be a way that a lot of businesses will continue to along rather than do a wholesale change of their system. You know, if you look at it, you know, that last slide there, if you just smash the roll, then that child's not going to sit there and just roll that off there. They're not going to waste all that opportunity that's there. Tweaks are great. They're low cost to implement. You know, it really doesn't take much it doesn't do anything to the system. And you're able to get back to your functioning with minimal cost and minimal disruption. Where you have to make sure that you're paying attention is most of the time the risk still remains. You still have that same vulnerability of your system that you had beforehand. You just changed it to where you don't see it as well at that particular time. That tends to be the way things are going in that operation. So what if we could do something different? What if we could go from security to continuity to resilience and get even more veteran-like, get even more forward-leaning, get further left of boom, as we used to say, and not have to deal with the disruption, and think about it from a position where we're not only absorbing our attacks and we're not just responding, but we learn from it and grow stronger. What if we actually got better every time we got attacked? Imagine if we could do that. That's what we're trying to get into, is that mentality of not just being response and recovery. That's where the security and continuity worlds live. Not just being resilient and bending but not breaking, but let's look a little bit left of boom and let's look at how we can absorb that energy of someone else and turn that into a strength within our organization. So as veterans, that's one of the things that I think we need to make sure that we're bringing to our companies. When you look at the business experience of where I've sat anyway, in the 5 years that I've been out, I've been in a couple of different companies, consulted on a couple more, is the business experience looks at people, process, and equipment. Do I have the right people? Did I build the process? And do I have the equipment to execute the mission to make the money? Great. That's a great perspective, and it's necessary. But oftentimes as veterans, we bring in a different perspective. When we look at people, process, and equipment, I know, you know, one of the things that the Marines we used to always talk about was the KISS. Keep it simple, stupid, or keep it super simple, whichever way you want to say that one. It's one of those things that we tend to really anchor on, because in complexity, when you're under duress, simplicity is the king. That's how we move forward. So in our experience, we will look for the simplest process, not the one that gets me most notice from the supervisor, right? I'm looking for the way that works, not the one that gives me the best PowerPoint slides. But we also tend to walk in and build our own culture. We have our own culture, and, you know, having done a lot of joint assignments, you know, the Air Force culture, the Army culture, all those cultures matter. But then once you bring everybody together, you start working through what is our mission and how can we all come together, that gung-ho mentality, so we come together as a collective to accomplish that mission. And then putting service before self. Those are things that we tend to see differently as we step into this environment. And we need to make sure that we capitalize on that as we're stepping into the environment. One of the ways that we do that is we tend to start from that battlefield operating system, warfighting functions. We've got a way that we kind of see the world and we break it down into simple parts so we can put it back together. Once we step into a business, we need to do that same thing for the business. That's one of the ways that we can increase our effectiveness. So every business operates a little bit differently, but they're all going to have some similar functions: HR and manpower, IT and InfoSec, business ops. Whatever it is in that process, we have to see the business for what it is. And that's where that alliances, those team building, that understanding your systems, that's all comes into play, because you, as that resilience professional, need to bring all that together so you can step it into that process. And that's one of those things that we can bring with the way we see the world differently. It's all about perspective. It's really all about perspective. Now, on the left here, you see an actor from Generation Kill. As a military guy, I love movies, right? I love watching these military movies, and my family hates watching them with me because my perspective is different than theirs. They tend to be entertained, and I'm sitting there looking at this guy on the left going, look how clean his hands are. There's no dirt anywhere on this guy. His weapon is obviously not in use. There's nothing, there's no functioning to it whatsoever. There's so many things missing in that picture from someone who's actually like operated. You completely see it differently. You're not able to just sit back and be entertained. You're constantly critiquing it. That, at least that's me. That's how I roll into that sort of stuff. Now, on the right, you see this guy, Frederick Smith. Frederick Smith, Vietnam veteran, Marine. You know, when he went to business school and pitched FedEx, they told him that topic will never work. It's not a sustainable model. But he didn't let that happen. He continued to tweak his business model, and then he went ahead and built the business. You know, and one of the things that he says all the time, when you see him speak, he'll talk about the fact that his military background gave him a different way of looking at things. You know, it gave him a drive and a way of looking at things that was different than everyone else's. And that's why he's been able to be so successful bringing his ideas forward. He didn't just let the status quo be the way things were. He challenged the way things were previously to build the world out the way that he sees it and the way that he thinks it should be. So again, you take that military mindset in the environment you're in: shoot, move, communicate, plan, med, survive. I don't know how many times I've heard that. You get to the point where that mantra just operates through who you are and how you see the world. Well, in business, you do the same thing. You engage the customer. You execute your business objectives. You look at those internal and external processes. You improve your product and innovate. You work on process improvement, and you always make sure you've got recovery operations. It's no different. As most veterans transition out of the military, we hit this wall as we're trying to step into the company, and we tend to second guess ourselves as we're going through that process. One of the things that's super important is to understand that it's really the same thing. It's just your environment has changed, and now you need to adapt to it. That's one of the things that, you know, that personal resilience of being able to bend without breaking, you know, that's that first step into getting past that to where you're absorbing what's around you and actually growing and becoming better. So how do we do that? I think a lot of times we try to figure out where we fit in. And when you step out of the military, one of the things a lot of businesses are concerned about is that you're going to step in and be this tiger, this carnivore that's just, you know, exerting himself or herself in the organization because you're so militarized. Well, to be honest, some people do that, but it's pretty rare. You know, the tiger is an endangered species, partially due to their own inability to flex to their environment, and partially due to the fact that when they step into the environment, they're seen as a danger, and essentially they've been hunted and pushed out. The tiger is not, you know, it's impressive, but it's not necessarily the model to follow. On the other hand, you've got the chameleon who just kind of steps into his environment and changes and adapts and just blends in. When you walk into the forest, there could be 100 chameleons around you and you'd never know. Well, if you're a veteran, is that really what you want? Is that really how you want to be? I've seen a lot of veterans do that in their companies. They just step in, they blend into their environments, and they're survivable, they're adaptable, but they've got a whole bucket full of skills that they could bring to bear in the business, and they're really just chameleons. They're just blending in and going along and getting along. They're not making the impact into the environment that they could. And that's one of the things that, where do you fit in that process? Well, I have a third course of action that I always like to throw out there is don't be the tiger. Don't jump in and try to show everybody how amazing and what a predator you are. And don't just blend in. Adapt, be different. Coyotes are a great example of that. The coyote in North America is one of the few predators that's actually expanded its territory over the last 100 years. They don't just adapt, they learn from their adversity. Oh yeah, the natural environment may be shrinking in North America. Fine. Then they start learning how to adapt into that environment. They don't just blend in. The coyote is able to operate in groups, but they can also break out of their groups and go operate independently. That's how they've been able to prosper. They've grown their territory. They've taken over areas where there used to be wolves or there used to be mountain lions. Now there's coyotes all over the place because they continue to expand their territory. They don't just survive, they thrive. And that's why you're seeing the coyote as a natural example in the environment of something that's able to move on from where they started. They are about to become the first predator in 3 million years to go transcontinental, to actually expand their territory from just North America down into South America. They've made it past the Panama Canal and they're knocking on the door to South America. So the adaptability of that coyote, no, they're not the apex predator. They're not that tiger sitting in there roaring and telling everybody how awesome they are, but they're also not the chameleon that just sits back and blends into the environment. So I think if you're going to look for an example, try to be a coyote, not a tiger or a chameleon. So at the end of the day, I'm going to open this up for questions here in a second. But at the end of the day, when you look at resilience, it's not just security. It's not just continuity and being able to recover. It's not just even though by definition it is just being able to absorb. I think veterans were able to go a little further than that. We don't want to just absorb the energy that's there and then go back to normal. We want to absorb that energy and use it to our advantage. We want to step into that process, improve the security and continuity of the company that we go to. Absolutely. But we also need to increase our resilience, help that company bend without breaking. And once we've done that, let's start looking like coyotes. Let's start adapting our organization so we can grow, not just ourselves and our teams, but the entire company that we're a part of. And there's a process to that. It's all about building your alliances, understanding, what tools you have and techniques that you have available to you, what systems are in place. All those things are important. But at the end of the day, that adaptation is what makes us different and allows us to make the world around us different, which is really what we've been trying to do since most of us joined the service, right? We become part of a collective, and then everybody contributes to that collective to make the whole organization better. The military was better when I left it than it was when I joined it, not because of anything I did, but because of things that everyone together collectively did. And I think that's going to continue. And I think that's what we as veterans need to do for the organizations we join going forward as we transition through. So that's kind of what I have to say about resilience. I've been doing it for a little while on the civilian side, did it for a long time on the military side. But hopefully that opens the door for folks to at least have a little difference in the way that they look at things. So it's a little more than just security or continuity, and especially in the cyber world where there's so much growth to have. I think this is really a place that we all need to double down and figure out how we're going to be those cyber coyotes out there. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. We got a few minutes left, and any questions, just drop them in the chat, and I'll see if I can figure out how to bring them onto the screen and help everybody out. All right. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So if anybody has a question or wants to stick around and chat one-on-one, we can do that. Or otherwise, I'm available on LinkedIn. My email, that's a VJ Williams on the email there. So if you've got questions or you want to link up, go ahead and hit me up on LinkedIn. And otherwise, have a great rest of your conference. I'll be in and out of different sessions. So if you got questions or you think of something later, shoot me an email or hit me up on LinkedIn.